Okay, I'm going to skip the obligatory sections where I reiterate what you just heard and focus on the connecting theme of transnationalism, or taking a transnational view of French history, in this case looking at 3 examples of cultural exchange between France and the Soviet Union. Christine Grant's paper offers some enticing ways to think about transnational connections by asking how the Maitreyi model traveled, not just to Russia, but more broadly to Western Europe in an age of rapid urbanization that was profoundly concerned with the disorders associated with the transition to an industrial society. She is also interested in the mechanisms by which foreign models were adopted in new contexts and how they reemerged after an interval of many decades. Her work suggests that a transnational perspective is especially useful in highlighting connections that exist at various levels simultaneously to produce institutional iterations in different social, economic, and ideological contexts. I would be interested to hear more details about the direct connection between Maitreyi and the Gorky colony. What did Makarenko have to say about his French predecessor? How were Maitreyi and Gorky embedded in the transnational phenomena of social experimentation that characterized both the 1840s and the 1920s? I would also suggest that Grant think about how her project intersects with the work of environmental historians who have studied the connection between moral reform, landscapes, nature, and rural life. Maitreyi's goal of moralizing urban delinquents and Gorky's goal of inculcating class consciousness mark both enterprises as fundamentally modernist, based on a belief in the intimate connection between the creation of a new society and the inner transformation of the individual, linked together across a distance of nearly 100 years, suggesting similarities between the July monarchy and the early Soviet period that are worth exploring. From that perspective, it would be illuminating to know more about the intellectual construction of both institutions and how they might be connected by shared vocabularies and mental frameworks. Finally, it is worth noting that both Maitreyi and the Gorky colony rapidly came to be regarded as anachronistic. Maitreyi was criticized in 1884 by a French senator for not providing youth with a trade relevant to urban life, and the Gorky colony was seen as failing to provide true proletarians with manufacturing skills in the context of the first 5-year plan. Excuse me. Harris situates exchange within the cultural context of Cold War cultural diplomacy and notes its official and diplomatic aspects. But she is also concerned to show how her work corresponds to the shifting historiographical trends in the history of Franco-Soviet relations, trends that reveal a less monolithic history of East-West antagonism. She brings greater nuance to the history of such encounters by examining how they took place on many levels: interstate relations, the dissemination of cultural knowledge, informal relations between individuals, and mutual impressions formed by the experiences of dining, shopping, and sightseeing. Her paper gives a vivid sense of how the Soviet dancers experienced the delights of the French capital, but provides little context to help us understand the broader significance of these encounters. How did the response of Soviet ballerinas compare to that of other foreign visitors? Was there something specific about the resonance of ballet, or that the resonance ballet had for both Soviet and French audiences and governments that helps us gauge the import and specificity of the event? How did both sides conceive of cultural exchanges at the time? And what more could we learn about the event by having more information about the state of Franco-Soviet relations during the Algeria crisis and the dying days of the Fourth Republic? Harris insists that, quote, personal and economic interactions made possible by Franco-Soviet dance exchanges were constitutive of Franco-Soviet Cold War relations, but we're not told precisely how. It may have been true that such exchanges belied the stark antagonisms of the Cold War, but they may also have caused the Soviet government to rethink its newly established policy of allowing its citizens to travel abroad more frequently, given that its cultural ambassadors were so eager to engage with capitalism in ways that provoked a destabilizing explosion of consumer desire. Bartram's paper does not discuss elements of a highly charged political context that would seem relevant to any study of Cold War cultural politics. How was the status of the AFU affected by the swings in French politics between 1945 and 1956, and how were its fortunes impacted by the suppression of the Hungarian revolt and the impact that had on the French Communist Party? What aspects of the Franco-Soviet relationship during this period would shed more light on the history of the AFU? How did each side understand the value of such cultural exchanges, both from the perspective of politics, but also in terms of cultural affinities? How could cultural politics be separated from Cold War politics per se? Harris seems to think so. The question was, could cultural politics be separated from Cold War politics per se? Harris seems to think so, but I wonder if Bartram would agree. I think Bartram may be missing the important correspondence between the AFU and the balance of forces in French domestic politics at the time it was formed. From 1944 to 1947, France was governed by a tripartite coalition of communists, socialists, and the MRP. The leadership of the AFU reflected the elements of this coalition, bringing together figures as diverse as Jacques Duclos, and Maurice Schumann, suggesting that its leadership was aware of the connection between Franco-Soviet relations and the maintenance of the post-war left-wing coalition. Finally, did the switch from the Fourth Republic to the Fifth Republic in 1958 affect the relationship between the AFU and the UF? I would think they may have been strengthened, given de Gaulle's view of the Soviets as a counterweight to the US. The overarching question raised by this panel seems to have become the central preoccupation of the entire field. What does it mean to look at French history through a transnational lens? Is transnational history a perspective, a theory, a method? Is it all of these, or merely the fashion of the moment? Do these three papers presented today help us answer this question? Bartram takes inspiration from Tyler Stovall's Transnational France, in which Stovall characterizes transnational history as an approach which he uses to explore how, quote, universalist tradition has shaped both France's interaction with other nations and its internal debates about diversity and national identity. According to Bartram, her paper looks at transnational relationships in order to better understand France, but she is also interested in matters that are inherently transnational in nature, like the Cold War international relationship, non-governmental organizations working across state boundaries, Europe-wide activist movements, cultural exchanges, and intercultural dialogue. One wonders if there's a tension between viewing France in transnational perspective and focusing on matters that are transnational precisely because they transcend the nation state. Stovall suggests that interactions are both constitutive of national identity and specifically concerned with viewing nation states within a global context. Grant's paper can best be characterized as a comparative study of two social experiments that are distinct in time and place. As such, she seems less concerned with questions involving transmission, whether of models, institutions, or ideas. Harris, by contrast, appears to be thinking about transnational frameworks in terms of contrasting opinions and cultural misunderstandings. As for Bartram, she seems to believe that transnational history excludes official relations between governments. It seems to me that transnational history should clearly distinguish itself from previous forms of historical analysis that depend on transnational encounters and connections. This would include not only old-fashioned diplomatic history, but studies that seek to document French opinions of foreigners or French attitudes towards other nations. Moreover, it should not be centrally concerned with how the French invented the other, or whether the French saw other states as models or foils that they appropriated in order to better contemplate their own problems and concerns. There are plenty of histories of this nature, and dressing them up with new labels seems pointless. The best thinking, in a programmatic sense, on the nature of transnational history is associated with Histoire croisée, which draws on debates about comparative history, transfer studies, and connected or shared history that have been carried out in the social sciences in recent years. Histoire croisée invites us to reconsider the interactions between different societies, cultures, scholarly disciplines, and traditions by focusing on interconnections that are consubstantial with the object of study and that demonstrate the causative nature of such interconnections. In the field of intellectual history, for example, one might think in terms of an interconnected history of intellectual movements and traditions that is concerned with circulation, construction, and the problematization of ideas. The ideological systems of the 19th century were pan-European in nature. French versions of liberalism and socialism were local variations of general political and intellectual tendencies. These ideological traditions developed within their own ecological niche, but they did not emerge in ignorance of other variations. They were products of dialogues mediated by local conditions. By focusing on the transnational or pan-European dimensions of 19th century intellectual history, it would be possible to show how transnational connections help shape an inventory of analytical categories associated with European social and political thought. In short, transnational history can be thought of as another kind of intersectional history, where movements, ideas, and events can be viewed as intersectional sites and as objects that illuminate a wider universe in ways that have an explanatory value. Okay. Okay, I hope we have some time for discussion. I guess we should see if the presenters have any response to the comments.
Yeah, I've got a quick response. You asked for more information about the actual transnational aspect of my work, and that's something that I didn't put into this paper just for time constraints, but mainly the actual transnational stuff where you've got connections and the model from France is being transmitted to Russia. That's happening much more in the Tsarist regime. It's a very explicit use of Maitreyi as an inspiration and a model. And Makarenko, in his account, very quickly, once he starts working with these homeless youths, looks back to what's already been written and what's already been done, and he says, we cannot do what these bourgeois people did. We have to do something different. So he very explicitly actually rejects that transnational connection and says, okay, we're doing something new here in the Soviet Union that couldn't be done anywhere else. Although, as you pointed out, there are still a lot of similarities between his methods and what Demesse had done at Maitreyi, and that's partly, I think, because they're both setting out, in their own view at least, against this nothingness, like nothing suitable has been done before and I'm doing something new. And in some ways you get similarities from that. But yeah, so this was definitely a comparative paper just because of the material I chose, but the transnational thing kind of goes through Tsarist Russia. That's where that is. Okay.
Yeah, giving comments is somewhat like touching the elephant.
Of course.
The sandpaper.
I'm fine.
Does anyone out here have?
Oh, sure. Or should I? Oh, it's okay. We can go to questions. It's not a big. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Oh, sure. I was just going to say that I totally understand and see what you mean about it needing more context, especially the context of what's going on in Franco-Soviet relations at this time. In this paper, my main goal was just to get a little bit of insight into how a wider audience is engaging with this idea of the Iron Curtain and what this face-to-face interaction might mean to, people beyond diplomats and the people who organized such exchanges. But I definitely think that for the chapter that this is going to develop into, it's crucial to understand these interactions, how they were viewed by officials, but also in the wider context of Cold War relations and why France, why look at French and Soviet cultural relations and specifically dance. So yeah, that's something that I'll work on. And thank you.
I mean, there are always things missing which exist in the larger work. So, yeah. I'm sorry.
Cool, yeah. Very good with microphones. Is this actually working?
I think so.
So my question piggybacks on this notion about histoire croisée. And so clearly, in Christine, in the first paper, it sounds as if your work is quite transnational often, and we got a more comparative part of your work. And the other two projects certainly seem to be largely histoire croisée. I mean, I completely agree with that idea that this transnational word is a tricky one in many ways, and histoire croisée is a very precise kind of way of thinking about this entanglement that we see through exchanges, and especially because here it seems as if we're thinking about government exchange as well as exchange of artists, writers, ordinary citizens to some extent, and also thinking about the press, which is highly national as well. So we're also getting a sense of how ideas about the other country are being projected to the larger populace through the press, which is another way of thinking about these kinds of entanglements. And so I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about the choice of transnational as a way to frame the panel, and about your thoughts on histoire croisée. And also, I guess, a little bit on, possibly, if there's time, on the way in which, and the extent to which different newspapers covered these exchanges differently. So, Humanité versus other newspapers, for example.
Want to take it?
Anything to say? Go ahead, you can start.
I don't know. I don't think. Well, I haven't got much to say about newspapers in mine, and I think I've kind of said that mine's much more like comparative. So maybe Casey and Faye would rather.
Yeah, I like this idea of history croisée as being a little more fitting for describing my work as well. Suppose I took on the transnational label a few years ago when it started to become big, and I was doing my dissertation research and looking at these non-governmental groups. But different newspapers' reactions to the film events that I studied were probably kind of where you might think. The more rightist papers had a little more criticism. L'Humanité was always like, AFU, go to their events, we love them, look all this great stuff, as one might imagine. And Combat would have a little bit, just little sort of quippets, kind of just descriptions. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I was trying to remember.
Right.
But there was, different coverages, as you might imagine.
Yeah, I don't know how I came to use transnational to describe my work, but I mainly came to this topic because I was very interested in France and very interested in Russia and wanted to find a way to look at the relations between those two countries. And so, yeah, it didn't start for me as like I must do something transnational. I just realized I really am interested in Russia and I'm really interested in France. As far as newspaper coverage, I found a similar a similar thing, right? That certain newspapers are going to be much more positive toward the Soviet Union, and others will be more negative, like Le Figaro, more skeptical of the Soviet Union. But I also have faced a difficulty in that way that French press was so much more diverse. You see a really wide range of opinions, and there are a lot of different journalists. But in the Soviet press that I've worked in, there's such fewer opinions, such fewer journalists, that it's been a challenge to bring together those two kinds of sources, because how comparable are they really? You have heavy censorship, you have just like a short list of people who write about these exchanges. So that's a challenge when you're working with different nations. Yeah. Especially in this case, but anyway.
I have questions, but I fear we're
Yeah, I
We're
don't
over
want to
time.
take
Yeah.
up. Yeah.
top that from individual.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.